Hello and welcome back to another edition of The Deep Dive. I am absolutely pumped for today's session because uh, we are tackling a monster of a topic.
We really are.
We're looking at a period of history that literally redefined an entire subcontinent. We're talking about the impact of colonial rule on Indian society.
It's huge. And it's foundational.
It is. And for our listeners who are tuning in specifically for their exam prep, especially the learner profile we love so much, this is going to be gold. This is, a special deep dive designed specifically for you UPSC aspirants.
It is indeed. I mean, if you want to understand modern India, the sociology of it, the politics, the economy, you have to understand what happened during those 200 years.
Exactly.
And before we get totally lost in that labyrinth of history and sociology, we do have a little bit of housekeeping to do, right?
We do, and this is really important, everyone. We put a massive amount of work into these breakdowns, digesting the sources so you don't have to. And if you are serious about this, if you want to lock this knowledge in, please, I'm humbly asking you to subscribe to the Simplified UPSC by PPP YouTube channel.
It genuinely helps.
It really does. It helps with retention when you're part of the community, getting those notifications, keeping the momentum going.
Right.
And look, if you're in a position to, if you have the means, please consider supporting us on Patreon. That support is, it's literally the fuel that keeps this engine running.
It allows us to keep bringing you this high-value content.
Yeah.
And we know everyone's at a different stage in their journey, but for those who can, that support lets us go deeper and create even better resources.
Absolutely. So a massive, warm thank you to all our current supporters.
You guys are incredible. You make this possible.
You really, really do. And guys, engage with us. Like the video, leave a comment below, share your thoughts, your questions, or even just a timestamp of a point that really clicked for you.
It helps the algorithm, sure, but it also helps us know what you're thinking.
It does. Oh, and for the resources, because I know you love your notes, the free notes with practice previous year questions or PYQs are available right now on the public Telegram channel.
That's a great starting point. But for those who want the full library, and this is for the serious preppers, you can get access to all the videos in this series at once without waiting.
Right, no weekly drip.
Exactly. Plus, you get the premium notes. We're talking detailed breakdowns, extra PYQs, and crucially, model mains answers. You can join the private Telegram library for all that.
So how do they do that?
Just DM the public channel to get sorted. The model mains answers are, I think, particularly useful for seeing how to structure the arguments we're about to discuss.
Perfect. Okay, housekeeping done. Let's dive in.
Let's do it.
Today we are unpacking Chapter 12 of Essential Sociology by Nitin Sangwan. The topic: Impact of Colonial Rule on Indian Society. Now, when I think of British rule, I typically think of history class. I think of dates, battles, Plassey, Buxar.
Viceroys with fancy mustaches.
Viceroys with very fancy mustaches, exactly. But we are doing sociology today. How is this different? Why do we need a sociological lens on something that seems like pure history?
That is the million-dollar question to start with, isn't it? Our mission today is to move beyond just the history lesson. History often focuses on the events, the battles, the treaties, the leaders. It's the what and the when.
Okay.
Sociology focuses on the structures, the how and the why. We aren't just listing what happened in 1857 or 1947. We are viewing these 200 years through a sociological lens to understand how the very fabric of society changed.
So, like looking at the X-ray of the building, not just the paint on the walls.
That's a perfect analogy. We want to know how the family structure changed, how the caste system morphed, how the village economy was completely restructured from the ground up. We're looking at the deep underlying shifts.
I like that, the X-ray view. So we aren't looking at who won the battle, but how that battle changed the life of a person living in a village 50 years later.
Exactly. And at the heart of this deep dive is what we can call the colonial paradox. Yeah. This is the core conflict you really need to wrap your head around for your exams.
The colonial paradox.
Okay. On one hand, the British Raj was a period of, well, absolute devastation for money. It was what sociologists and economists call the economic drain. It crushed domestic industries, it led to famines, it impoverished the masses.
Right, the dark side of the story.
The very dark side. But, and here's the paradox, it inadvertently birthed modern India. It created the very conditions for nationalism, for social reform, and for the modern class structure we see today.
So it's the story of how a system designed to exploit actually ended up creating the tools for its own removal.
Precisely. It's a dialectical contradiction if you want to get technical and, sound a bit Marxist. The thesis of colonialism created its own antithesis in Indian nationalism.
The British didn't intend to create a unified India that would kick them out?
Not at all. But their policies made that outcome almost inevitable. And just to be super clear for our UPSC listeners, this discussion is going to act as a full summary of that chapter, and we are going to be heavily linking it with PYQs from the main papers, especially from 2017 to 2023.
So keep your ears open for those connections.
Absolutely. They're key.
Awesome. Let's start with the money, or rather the lack of it. Let's get into the economic transformation. I was reading through the source material, and it mentions that colonialism and capitalism integrated India into the world economy, but in a very specific way. It says in a subservient manner. That sounds loaded. What does that look like on the ground?
It is loaded, but it's also incredibly accurate. It essentially means India ceased to be an independent economic actor on the world stage.
What were we before?
Well, before colonial rule, let's remember, India was a massive exporter. We weren't just growing wheat. For centuries, we were the workshop of the world for textiles.
Right, the muslin from Dhaka, the calicos.
Exactly. The muslin of Dhaka, the calicos of Bengal. These weren't just cloths. They were luxury goods desired globally. The Romans used to complain about draining their gold reserves to buy Indian spices and textiles. India was a sink for the world's bullion.
I remember reading that the early British textile mills in Manchester actually saw Indian cloth as a major threat.
They absolutely did.
Yeah.
They couldn't compete on quality or price initially. But under the British, India was forcibly integrated into the global capitalist system, but only as a supplier of cheap raw materials and a captive market for expensive finished goods from British factories.
So it's a complete inversion of the economic relationship.
A complete 180. We went from being a net exporter of finished goods to a net importer of those same goods and an exporter of the raw stuff.
So instead of selling the world beautifully made cloth, we're now just shipping them raw cotton.
And they spin it into cloth in Manchester or Liverpool using their new machines and then sell it back to us at a huge markup.
And we have to buy it because our own industry is gone.
Correct. And that process leads to one of the key sociological concepts you need to know: deindustrialization. It's a huge theme.
Deindustrialization. So it wasn't just that Indian industry didn't grow, it was actively dismantled.
Actively destroyed is the term many scholars use. The traditional artisans, the weavers, the metal workers, the craftsmen, their livelihoods were systematically wiped out over a few generations.
How exactly? Was it just that British machine-made cloth was better and cheaper? Was it just natural market forces?
Not at all. It wasn't a fair fight. The game was rigged from the start. British goods were imported into India with zero tariffs or very, very low duties, so they flooded the market.
Okay.
But if an Indian weaver wanted to sell his cloth to Britain, he faced massive prohibitive tariffs, sometimes as high as 70 to 80%.
Wow. 70 to 80%.
And even within India, moving Indian goods across different regions often incurred internal taxes that British goods were conveniently exempt from. It was a one-way street of free trade.
So the Indian artisan, working by hand, was forced to compete with steam-powered machines in Liverpool while also having his hands tied by colonial tax laws.
That's it in a nutshell. It was impossible to compete.
That's the destruction part of the paradox, then. It's not free trade, it's a monopoly disguised as trade.
And the social impact of this was, well, devastating. Think about it. When these millions of artisans who were highly skilled professionals lost their livelihoods, where did they go?
I'm guessing the cities? To find work in factories.
That's what would happen in a normal capitalist evolution, like what we saw in Europe. People move from farms to factories. That's urbanization. That's the Industrial Revolution.
Right.
But in India, because deindustrialization happened without any corresponding industrialization, these artisans were forced back to the land. They couldn't get jobs in factories because the British weren't building factories in India. Not for Indians anyway.
So they went back to their villages to try and farm.
Exactly. This led to a phenomenon called the overcrowding of agriculture. They became landless laborers or tenant farmers, competing for scarce resources. It massively increased the pressure on land, which is a structural problem we are still dealing with today in Indian sociology.
Wow. So it actually ruralized the country in a way. We went backwards in terms of occupational structure.
In many ways, yes. It reversed the urbanization trend in many traditional industrial centers. And the sources gave some staggering numbers on this drain of wealth. I wrote this down because it shocked me. From 1890 to 1947, military spending alone was around 50% of the total government budget.
50%? That is insane.
Half the budget. Imagine if half of a country's budget today went just to the military.
And it wasn't even a military to defend India.
Precisely. It wasn't for the defense of the Indian people, but to maintain the empire's grip on India and expand its influence elsewhere. Indian revenues paid for the army that kept Indians suppressed. It also paid for British wars in Africa, China, Afghanistan, the Middle East. It was Indian money paying for British conquest.
That's the drain.
And here's another statistic from the source that really puts the poverty into perspective. At the time of independence, domestic savings were less than 3% of the gross national product, or GNP.
Less than 3%. That implies people had absolutely no buffer, no capital, nothing to fall back on.
Exactly, less than 3%. Compare that to around 30% in 2022. It shows you how little surplus capital was left in the hands of the Indian people. They were living hand to mouth.
And the surplus was being siphoned off.
This is being siphoned off through what Dadabhai Naoroji famously called the drain of wealth pensions for British officers living back in England, profits for British companies, massive administrative costs for the India office in London.
So it was like a sponge.
It was exactly like a sponge, soaking up the wealth on the banks of the Ganges and squeezing it out on the banks of the Thames. That imagery is powerful because it's so accurate.
It really is. Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting for the exam. How does this economic devastation link to sociology? I see a mention of A.R. Desai here in the outline.
Yes, and this is a crucial PYQ linkage. You will often see questions asking about the Marxist perspective on Indian nationalism. A.R. Desai is the go-to scholar here. His book, Social Background of Indian Nationalism, is legendary. You have to know it.
And his argument was?
He argued that you cannot understand Indian nationalism just by looking at love for the country or cultural pride. Those things are there, of course. But you have to look at the economic contradictions.
Unpack that for us. Economic contradictions. It sounds very academic. What does it mean for the average person back then?
It basically means that the way people made a living, their material reality, was in direct conflict with the colonial system. Desai argued that colonialism, by introducing modern capitalism, even in this distorted, exploitative form, created new social classes that had never existed in the same way in pre-colonial India.
Okay, what kind of new classes are we talking about?
Well, think about it. Before the British, your social structure was largely feudal lords, peasants, and artisans. Now you had the rise of an industrial working class, the proletariat, in the few factories that did come up, like in Bombay or Calcutta.
Right.
You had a new merchant class, the bourgeoisie, trying to trade in this new system.
Yeah.
And crucially, you had a Western-educated middle class, lawyers, doctors, teachers, clerks.
So new players enter the game.
Exactly. And each of these new classes, over time, came to realize that their economic interests were completely blocked by the British presence.
How so?
The Indian merchant couldn't trade freely because of British monopolies and banking discrimination. The factory worker was brutally exploited in British-owned factories with no labor rights. The educated middle-class professional couldn't get high-ranking jobs in the government because they were all reserved for white men in the Indian civil service.
So nationalism wasn't just some emotional patriotic response. It was also a very practical reaction to being broke and blocked from opportunity.
In the Marxist view, presented by Desai, yes, the material conditions, the poverty, the drain of wealth, the lack of opportunity, created the friction that sparked the fire of nationalism.
It aligns economic self-interest with the national interest.
Perfectly. Desai argues that the British replaced the old feudal mode of production with a capitalist one. It was imperfect, it was cruel, but it changed the social structure enough to allow these new classes to emerge and, eventually, organize. They collectively realized, we cannot prosper as long as the British are here.
That makes a lot of sense. If I'm a merchant and I can't sell my goods because of some law passed by the viceroy, I'm going to start funding the people who want to kick the viceroy out.
And that leads us beautifully to the silver lining, the other side of the paradox, the unification. I mean, the British didn't build railways because they loved us, right?
Definitely not. That's a romantic myth that gets peddled around. They built railways for two very selfish reasons: security and commerce.
Nail on the head. One, security. They needed to move troops quickly to quell rebellions. Remember 1857? They were terrified of that happening again. They needed to be able to rush a regiment from Bombay to Delhi in days, not months.
And two, commerce.
Commerce. They needed to move raw cotton, grain, indigo, and jute from the deep interior of India to the ports of Bombay and Calcutta so they could ship it all to England.
So it was essentially a tool of extraction and control, like a giant vacuum cleaner hose extending into the heart of India.
A perfect description.
Mm.
But sociologically, this created what we call administrative, economic, and geographic unification. This is the great unintended consequence.
The irony is just, it's so rich here. The very tools they built to control the country, the trains, the telegraph, the postal system, became the tools the nationalists used to organize against them.
Precisely. You can't have a national movement if people in Bengal can't talk to people in Bombay. Before the railways, a journey across India took months. It was dangerous, expensive, and most people never did it.
But with the railways,
It took days. This allowed leaders like Gandhi, Tilak, Gokhale, and Bose to travel, to speak to masses in different provinces, to build a pan-Indian movement. The postal system allowed nationalist newspapers and pamphlets to circulate across the country.
so while the intent was exploitation, the unintended consequence was the creation of a physical network that literally bound the nation together.
It's like they built the internet of the 19th century to spy on us and control us, but we used it to organize a revolution.
That's a fantastic analogy. They built the network for their own efficiency, and the virus of nationalism was uploaded onto it.
It broke down regional barriers.
Yeah.
A person from the south and a person from the north could meet on a train. They could share their grievances, discover their common enemy. It started to dissolve the geographical and psychological fragmentation of India.
So we have this economic integration that bleeds the country dry, but also stitches it together physically. That sets the stage perfectly for our next big topic, the sociology of nationalism. We touched on Desai, but let's go deeper. How did a country as diverse as India, I mean, we're talking about so many languages, religions, castes, how on earth did it develop a single national consciousness?
That is a question that has fascinated sociologists for decades. And if you look at the source material, it points first and foremost to the common enemy factor.
The enemy of my enemy is my friend.
In a way, yes. It wasn't necessarily that a Tamil peasant and a Punjabi merchant suddenly felt a deep, abiding cultural love for each other overnight. It was that they both recognized they were being impoverished and humiliated by the same source.
So it's a shared reaction.
A shared reaction to the peculiar socioeconomic nature of colonial rule. Every section of society, from the peasant to the prince, felt the boot on their neck in one way or another. But we also have to talk about who led this reaction. The sources are very clear in highlighting the rise of the urban middle class.
Right, the new middle class. This is a term that comes up constantly in the UPSC syllabus.
Yes. And this class was unique. They were educated in English, another tool the British introduced for their own purposes. Remember Lord Macaulay's famous minute on education?
Yes, he wanted to create a class of... What was the line?
A class person's Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect.
That's the one. He wanted to create lower-level clerks for the administration because bringing British officers for every small job was just too expensive.
He wanted clones. He wanted loyal intermediaries who would translate British will to the Indian masses. But by learning English, this class got access to a whole world of Western ideas. They didn't just read the clerical manuals.
They read John Stuart Mill, they read about the Magna Carta.
They read about the French Revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity. They read the American Declaration of Independence. They read about democracy and self-determination.
And they must have turned around and said, hey, wait a minute, you guys talk about liberty and democracy in the Houses of Parliament in London, but you practice tyranny and despotism in Calcutta. Why doesn't this apply to us?
Exactly. They held a mirror up to the British and exposed their hypocrisy. They became the primary carriers of modern nationalism. They could articulate the grievances of the masses in the language of the oppressor. They could fight the British in their own courtrooms, using their own laws against them.
That made them incredibly dangerous to the colonial state.
Infinitely. So English education was another one of those classic double-edged swords.
Yeah.
They wanted clerks, but they got revolutionaries.
That is fascinating.
And this brings us back to A.R. Desai's Social Background of Indian Nationalism. This is such a classic text. If you are writing a mains answer about the social roots of nationalism, you simply have to mention him. He details how the British destruction of the old feudal economy created specific grievances for every single class. Peasants, artisans, workers, and the intelligentsia.
He maps it all out.
He maps out how these separate grievances eventually coalesced into a unified national movement. It's a materialist explanation, but a very powerful one.
Can we talk about the peasants for a second? Because they were the vast majority of the population. How did their life change structurally? This ties into the village studies part of our outline. We have to talk about the myth of the little republics.
Oh, the little republics.
Yeah.
This is a concept you really need to understand so you can then debunk it in an answer.
Okay.
It comes from Sir Charles Metcalfe, a British administrator in the early 19th century. He described Indian villages as these self-sufficient, isolated, unchanging little republics.
I've heard that phrase.
He famously wrote that empires fall, dynasties tumble, the Mughals come and go, the Afghans invade, but the village community remains the same. He painted this picture of a timeless, isolated bubble.
It sounds profound, almost romantic, like the Shire in Lord of the Rings, just farming and minding their own business while the world burns around them. But the expert analysis here says, not so much.
It is a romantic image, but sociologically, it's largely incorrect. And questions often pop up in mains, like the 2021 question on village studies, asking you to critique this very view.
So what's the reality?
Sociological studies show that this complete isolation was never really true. Villages were always linked to the wider world through trade networks, through pilgrimage routes, through marriage alliances. You rarely married inside your own village, and of course, through paying taxes to whatever empire was in charge.
But the British changed things.
They didn't just change things, they shattered that illusion of isolation completely.
How so? What was the mechanism?
The land revenue systems, the zamindari system in Bengal, the Riatwari and Mahalwari systems elsewhere. These reforms forced the village directly into the jaws of the global market. A farmer wasn't just growing food for his family in the village anymore. He now had to grow cash crops.
Like cotton, indigo, or jute.
Exactly, because he needed to pay his taxes to the British in cash.
That shift from paying in grain to paying in cash seems pivotal.
It was a fundamental shift. Under the Mughals, for instance, you often paid tax as a share of the crop. If the harvest was bad, the revenue demand often adjusted downwards, or you simply paid a percentage of the smaller amount of grain.
But the British
demanded a fixed amount of cash on a fixed date, regardless of whether the monsoon failed or the crop succeeded. To get cash, you have to sell your produce to the market.
And that connects the farmer in a remote village in Vidarbha to the commodity exchange in London.
Precisely. If the price of cotton collapsed in London because of a bumper crop in the American South after their Civil War, the Indian farmers starved in Maharashtra, that is not isolation. That is brutal, unforgiving integration. The village was now a tiny, vulnerable cog in the giant global capitalist economy.
That is a great point. It just completely kills the idea that the village was this timeless, protected bubble.
It also introduced the concept of land as a commodity. Before, land was often communal or held by customary right. You couldn't really sell it in the modern sense. You had rights to cultivate it. The British introduced private property rights for land.
Which meant it could be bought, sold, and crucially mortgaged.
And that leads directly to the rise of the moneylender as a powerful figure.
Of course.
Farmers needed cash to pay the rigid taxes. They borrowed from the local moneylender. If the crop failed, they couldn't pay back the loan. The moneylender, using the new British courts and legal system, would then seize the land.
And this created a whole new class of landless laborers.
Yes, and a class of absentee landlords who often lived in cities but owned vast tracts of village land. The entire social structure of the village was turned upside down.
So much for the peaceful, unchanging little republic. It sounds more like a pressure cooker.
It absolutely was.
Yeah.
And that pressure eventually erupted in numerous peasant movements and rebellions. The Indigo Revolt, the Deccan Riots, these weren't just random acts of violence. They were structural responses to this new, harsh economic reality.
Let's move on to segment 3. This is a big one for sociology students. Modernization of Indian tradition. And the name we absolutely have to know here is Yogendra Singh.
Yogendra Singh is essential. His book, Modernization of Indian Tradition, is a canonical text. You cannot write a good answer on social change in India in the mains without quoting him.
Okay, so before we get into his main thesis, can we clarify some of the terms here? The outline mentions Westernization versus Sanskritization. We hear these tossed around a lot. What's the actual difference?
This brings in another giant of Indian sociology, M.N. Srinivas. He was the one who really distinguished between these two processes. Let's start with Sanskritization.
Okay.
This is an internal or endogenous process of social change. It's when lower-ranked castes or tribal groups emulate the rituals, the diet, the customs, and the lifestyle of the upper castes, specifically the twice-born castes like Brahmins and Kshatriyas. in an attempt to move up the social ladder.
So things like giving up meat, wearing the sacred thread, performing certain pujas that were traditionally reserved for upper castes.
Exactly. It's all about mobility within the traditional caste framework.
Yeah.
You aren't trying to tear down the system, you were trying to rise in it by copying the people at the top. It implicitly accepts that the traditional caste hierarchy is the valid scale of success.
Got it. So that's an internal process. What about Westernization?
Westernization, on the other hand, is the result of external influence, specifically the 150-plus years of British rule. It refers to changes in technology, institutions, ideology, and values that came from the West.
So adopting Western dress, dining habits.
Yes, but it's deeper than that. It's also adopting Western legal systems, bureaucracy, rationalism, humanitarianism, and secularism as values.
I see. So Sanskritization is looking up at the Brahmins to gain status within the traditional hierarchy, while Westernization is looking across at the British to gain status or, well, modernity.
That's a simplified but very effective way to think about it. Now, where Yogendra Singh comes in is that he looks at how these processes and others interact. His core argument, and this is a high-yield topic for exams, is that tradition and modernity are not opposites. They are not a binary.
Because usually that's how we think of them, right? Oh, if you become modern, you have to lose your tradition. Like if you wear jeans and speak English, you must have stopped doing puja or respecting your elders.
Exactly. That's the binary zero-sum game view. Singh argues that in India they coexist, they interact, they even reinforce each other. He classifies changes into two types, orthogenetic and heterogenetic.
Those are big words. Let's break them down for the learner.
Sure. Orthogenetic refers to changes that come from within the Indian culture. Things like the Cultural Renaissance, the Bhakti movement, the process of Sanskritization, the influence of Buddhism or Jainism on Hinduism. These are internal evolutions. They grew from the local soil, so to speak.
Okay. And heterogenetic.
Heterogenetic refers to changes coming from outside, from external sources. This includes the Islamic influence from earlier periods, and crucially for our topic, the Western or colonial influence.
And Singh's point is that the external, the heterogenetic, doesn't just replace the internal.
Right. He argues that modernization in India was selective. We adopted the bureaucracy, the railways, the army structure, the external form of modernity, but we didn't necessarily adopt the universal values of individualism or mass education immediately. And most interestingly, modernity often reinforced tradition.
Can you give us an example of that? Modernity reinforcing tradition. That sounds completely counterintuitive.
Think about caste associations. Caste is a very traditional concept, right?
Yes, ancient.
But in the modern era, beginning in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, castes began to form modern registered associations with presidents, secretaries, bank accounts, and printed pamphlets. They used these modern organizational structures to lobby the modern democratic government for rights, reservations, or political power.
Oh, that's brilliant. So they're using a modern tool, like a formal association or a political lobby, to strengthen a traditional identity, which is caste.
Precisely. Or take the printing press. The British brought the printing press to India. It's a tool of modernity. But what did Indian reformers use it for? They used it to print and mass circulate the Vedas and the Upanishads, making ancient religious texts accessible to people, including lower castes and women who were previously banned from even hearing them.
So technology, modernity, was used to revitalize and spread religion tradition.
Exactly. This connects directly to that 2023 PYQ mentioned in our source. Are tradition and modernity antithetical to each other?
And the answer, based on Yogendra Singh, is a resounding no. They adapt, they merge, they create a hybrid. You can work in a high-tech IT park, which is a symbol of modernity, and still go home and perform a very traditional puja.
They aren't mutually exclusive. This creates a unique Indian modernity, which is very different from Western modernity. We modernized, but we didn't just become Europeans, we became modern Indians.
I love that. It really explains the complexity of India today. We aren't just one or the other. We are this constant dynamic hybrid.
Precisely. And understanding that hybridity is what the sociology of India is all about.
Okay, moving on to segment 4, social reform and the new middle class. The British rule wasn't just about economics and politics. It sparked this massive, intense conversation about our own society. We saw movements targeting sati, child marriage, untouchability.
Yes, the 19th century was a period of intense social churning. It's often called the Indian Renaissance for a reason. And sociologically, we can categorize these movements into two broad types, reformist and revivalist.
Okay, what's the key distinction between the two?
Reformist movements, like the Brahmo Samaj, which was led by Rajaram Mohan Roy, tried to synthesize Hinduism with Western liberalism and rationalism. They argued that the social evils, like sati or idolatry, were later corruptions, and that the true ancient form of Hinduism found in the Upanishads was actually monotheistic and compatible with reason, science, and human rights.
So they wanted to cleanse the religion using Western logic as a tool. They were looking forward, in a sense, and were open to incorporating Western ideas.
Very much so. Now, the revivalist movements like the Arya Samaj, led by Dayanand Saraswati, took a different approach. Their slogan was, "Go back to the Vedas." They believed the ancient Vedic texts held the pure, uncorrupted truth and that we needed to purify Hinduism from within. They rejected Western influence, but also rejected the later corruptions like the rigid Puranic caste system and idolatry.
So they were more aggressive in asserting the superiority of Vedic culture. Their message was, we don't need the West. We had the real truth all along. We just need to rediscover it.
Exactly. It's a fascinating contrast, isn't it? Both wanted change, but the source of their inspiration was different. One looked forward to a synthesis with the West, the other looked back to a pure Vedic past.
But what they had in common was that both attacked the rigid, ritualistic, and superstitious parts of the society they saw around them. Both wanted to improve the status of women and challenge caste barriers.
Yes, and there was a PYQ in 2017 specifically asking about two important socio-religious movements. So knowing the difference between the Brahmo Samaj and the Arya Samaj is absolutely crucial.
Now, what about the British role in all this? We talk about the banning of sati and the Widow Remarriage Act. Did the British actively want to reform India? Was that their benevolent mission to civilize the natives?
Initially, yes. There was a strong push by the utilitarians and liberals in Britain who genuinely believed Indian society was backward and needed fixing. They were the ones who pushed for laws against sati. But here's where the sociological nuance comes in. After the massive revolt of 1857, the British became extremely cautious.
Right, because the greased cartridges issue that sparked it was fundamentally a religious and cultural issue.
Exactly. They realized that interfering too much in social and religious customs could cause a massive backlash, a cultural mutiny. So they backed off. Post-1857, the British policy shifted dramatically. They often started supporting the most orthodox and traditional elites, the Brahmins, the zamindars, the princes, to help them keep the peace.
They didn't want to rock the boat anymore.
They didn't. So you had this bizarre situation where the colonial power, which claimed to be civilizing India, actually ended up reinforcing caste rigidity and conservative values because it helped them maintain stability and control.
That's the colonial bargain mentioned in the notes.
That's it. They traded social reform for political stability. They became the preservers of the status quo when it suited them. They realized that a conservative, divided society was far easier to rule than a reforming, uniting one.
Let's talk about the group that was driving these reforms, the middle class. We mentioned them earlier as the carriers of nationalism.
Yes, this new middle class was a direct structural change brought about by the British. We're talking about bureaucrats, lawyers, doctors, teachers, journalists. This class in this form didn't really exist in feudal India. They were a product of Western education.
And sociologically, they acted as a bridge.
A perfect term. They were the bridge. They could understand the British legal and political language, but they were deeply rooted in Indian society and felt its pains. They were the ones who could translate the modern ideas of liberty, equality, and democracy to the Indian masses.
So they were the interface.
The interface and the agitators. They realized that for India to progress, it needed social reform and political freedom. The two were linked. You couldn't have one without the other.
Right. You can't really ask for political liberty from the British while simultaneously denying social liberty to your own widows or to people from lower castes.
That realization was the engine that fueled both the social reform movements and the nationalist movement.
Let's zoom in on segment 5. Impacts on specific sections of society. This is really important. Let's start with women. The source says their condition was deplorable pre-independence.
It was dire by any measure. Sati, child marriage, a strict ban on widow remarriage, purdah, a complete lack of education, female infanticide in some communities. Now, while the reform movements we just discussed started to chip away at this, we have to be realistic. The benefits were often limited to the urban upper castes and upper classes. The reforms didn't really trickle down to the rural poor immediately.
And the term patriarchal bargain comes up here. What does that mean in this context?
Yes. This is a concept often associated with scholars like Deniz Kenioti, but it's very applicable here. It implies that even within the reforms, the fundamental patriarchal structure wasn't really dismantled. For example, women were educated, but often with the primary goal of making them better wives for the new educated men and better mothers to raise modern sons.
So it was learn to read so you can raise smart sons for the new nation, not learn to read so you can become an independent individual or have a career.
Exactly. It was reform within patriarchy, not reform of patriarchy. Furthermore, the British legal system sometimes even codified and hardened patriarchal norms. When the British courts had to decide on family law matters like marriage or inheritance, they often consulted orthodox pandits and Malvis.
And those religious experts would give the most conservative interpretations of the texts.
They often did. And the British then made those conservative interpretations into binding law. So in some ways, the customary flexibility that existed in some communities was lost, and strict, rigid patriarchal rules became the law of the land.
That's a really sobering reality. It wasn't instant liberation at all. It was far more complex. What about tribal communities? I see a link here to a policy of isolation.
This is critical for exams because questions often ask about the isolation versus assimilation debate. This is the famous debate between Verrier Elwin, who favored isolation to protect unique tribal cultures, and G.S. Gurry, who favored assimilation, famously calling tribes backward Hindus.
And the British policy was?
The British largely followed a policy of isolation. They created excluded areas or partially excluded areas where normal administrative laws didn't apply.
Was this to protect the tribes? To keep their culture pure and safe from outsiders?
Or that was the official justification, yes. They claimed they wanted to protect tribes from exploitative moneylenders and traders from the plains. But sociologically and economically, the hidden agenda was to secure the forests.
Follow the money. Or the timber, in this case.
Exactly. By isolating the tribes and declaring forests as state property through the Forest Acts, the British could exploit the vast timber resources for building railways and ships without any interference from the traditional owners of the forest.
So this led to massive alienation.
Massive alienation and dispossession. The tribes lost their traditional rights over the forest, the right to hunt, to gather firewood, to practice shifting cultivation. This dispossession was the root cause of numerous tribal uprisings, like the Santhal Hul or the Munda Rebellion led by Bruce Munda. They weren't just being isolated, they were being robbed of their entire livelihood.
So isolation was really just another word for quarantine for exploitation.
That is a very, very apt way to put it.
And finally, in this section, let's talk about caste. We touched on it with the caste associations, but there is a specific mention of the census of 1901 and an administrator named Herbert Risley. Why is a simple head count so important sociologically?
Oh, the 1901 census is a massive turning point in the sociology of caste in India. Before the British, caste was, in some regions, and that sometimes, relatively fluid. It wasn't always this rigid, written-down pan-Indian hierarchy. You could move up or down if your group acquired land or political power.
But Risley changed that.
Herbert Risley, the census commissioner, had this ethnographic obsession. He decided to officially classify and rank every single caste in India based on what he called social precedence.
He wanted to make a definitive ranked list of everyone.
You wanted to put everyone in a neat box. And the moment you tell people, we, the government, they create an official document that ranks you, what happens? Everyone wants to be at the top of that list.
Right. Wait, you're putting me at number 4? No, I'm definitely number 2.
Exactly. It triggered a massive scramble for status. Castes started forming associations specifically to petition the government, submitting memoranda claiming we are actually descended from Kshatriyas, or we are actually a subsect of Brahmins. It kicked off this process of what sociologists call crystallization. The British attempt to measure and classify the caste system actually made it more rigid, more formal, and more political than it had ever been before.
That is a classic case of the observer effect, right? By observing and measuring the system, they fundamentally and permanently changed it.
Absolutely. The flexible social hierarchy became a rigid bureaucratic category, and this legacy is still with us. When we talk about reservations or the caste census today, we are still operating within the framework that the British census created.
We are coming into the home stretch here. Segment 6, the legacy. The British left in 1947, but they left a lot of baggage behind. What stuck around?
A lot. We call it post-colonial continuity. The most obvious is the institutional legacy. The steel frame of India, the bureaucracy, like the IAS and IPS, is a direct descendant of the ICS, the Indian Civil Service. The army structure, the parliamentary system, the legal code like the IPC, these are all fundamentally British imports.
And the source mentions a critical analysis here, that the bureaucracy was designed for ruling, not for serving.
This is a point you can use in almost any answer about Indian administration in your mains exam.
Mm-hmm.
The colonial bureaucracy was Weberian in its structure. It was hierarchical, rule-bound, impersonal. But its goal was colonial control. It was designed to collect taxes and maintain law and order for a foreign power. It was about control, not development.
The very name for the district magistrate was the collector.
Because his main job was collecting revenue. And when we became independent, we kept the structure almost entirely, but we tried to change the goal to development and public service. But the mindset, that colonial mindset of distance from the people, the obsession with red tape, the elitism, the my bap culture where the official is the parent figure, that often remained.
And that's still a challenge.
A persistent challenge in Indian governance. The bureaucrat is still often seen as a sahib rather than a public servant.
That explains so much about the interaction between the common person and the government office, even today.
It does. And then there's the economic legacy. We talked about the drain, but look at the geography of development in India. The British primarily developed the port cities, Bombay, which is now Mumbai, Calcutta, now Kolkata, and Madras, now Chennai.
Because that's where they shipped the goods out from.
They were the gateways to England. The hinterland states like Bihar, UP, the central regions, were largely neglected or just used as sources for raw materials. This created a massive regional disparity that we are still fighting to correct today.
The coastal states are generally more industrialized and developed.
While the interior often struggles with poverty and lack of infrastructure, that imbalance is a direct inheritance from colonial logistics. The train lines were built to drain the interior, not to develop it.
It's amazing and kind of terrifying how decisions made 150 years ago for the purpose of shipping cotton are still dictating the GDP of entire states today.
That is the power of combining history and sociology. You cannot fix the problems of today if you don't understand their roots in the past.
So to wrap this all up, and this has been quite a journey through 200 years of social change, let's do a quick recap of the key takeaways.
Sure. I think the big takeaway is that colonialism was a profoundly contradictory force. On one hand, it drained India economically, shattered its traditional industries, and impoverished the masses.
But on the other hand,
In doing so, it inadvertently provided the infrastructure, both physical, like the railways, and intellectual, like English education and modern law, for India to unite and eventually emerge as a modern nation-state.
it was a painful, destructive, and coercive birth.
It was. It was modernization through subjugation, not choice. But it created the structural reality of the India we live in today, for better and for worse.
And to understand Indian society today, from our caste politics to our railway system to the very language we are speaking right now, you have to look back at how these 200 years restructured the entire social fabric.
Absolutely. You can't escape it.
Keep learning, keep questioning. That's the vibe. Listeners, we really, really hope this breakdown helped you connect the dots for your UPSC prep. It's not just about memorizing facts, it's about understanding the why.
Absolutely. The why is what gets you the high marks in mains. It shows analytical depth.
Now, a final reminder. If this deep dive added value to your preparation, please subscribe to Simplified UPSC by PPP. It helps us hugely to grow the community.
It really does.
And again, a humble request. If you are capable, please consider supporting us on Patreon. It keeps the lights on and this high-quality content flowing. And a massive shout-out again to everyone who already supports us. You guys are the real MVPs.
You are. And don't forget to like this video and share your valuable comments. We do read them.
Yes, we do. And for those all-important notes for revision, the free notes with practice PYQs are on our public Telegram channel. But if you want the full premium organized library with model mains answers and detailed notes for the entire series, DM us on the public Telegram channel to join the private group.
It's a great resource, well worth it if you're serious.
All right, that is it for today's deep dive. Keep learning, keep questioning, and we'll see you in the next one.
Goodbye, everyone.